September 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. The sand hadn't stopped moving for 3 days. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery stood in his command tent, staring at a map covered in red pins. Each pin represented a German position. Each pin represented a problem. And somewhere in London, men who had never smelled cordite were telling him exactly how to solve those problems. The order had arrived that morning. Hold the Ruvaisat Ridge. Do not withdraw under any circumstances. The War Cabinet considered the position strategically essential. Montgomery read the order twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. Outside, the desert wind pressed against the canvas walls of the tent with a sound like slow breathing. The interior smelled of petrol fumes and the particular kind of exhaustion that has no cure except victory. Maps covered every flat surface. Supply requisitions covered the maps. Intelligence summaries covered the requisitions. Somewhere beneath all of it, if you dug down far enough, was the actual ground that men were dying on. The ridge was a death trap. Anyone with field experience knew it. The Germans had zeroed their artillery on every approach with the patience of men who had nothing else to do and unlimited ammunition to do it with. British tanks that moved forward burned within minutes. Infantry that dug in died within hours. The position was not strategic. It was symbolic. Politicians in London wanted a line on a map that showed they were not retreating. Montgomery had lost 1,100 men on that ridge in the past week. 1,100 letters to write. 1,100 families who would never see their sons again. For a piece of desert that held no water, no roads, and no tactical value whatsoever. He called for his signals officer. "Get me a direct line to the War Cabinet." Scrambled. The connection took 40 minutes. The signals officer returned twice during that interval to update Montgomery on the delay, and both times Montgomery was standing in the same position, staring at the same map, his hands clasped behind his back with a stillness that newer members of his staff had not yet learned to read correctly. The older ones knew it was not patience, it was calculation. When the line finally came through, Montgomery did not wait for pleasantries. "I will not hold Ruvaisat Ridge." The voice on the other end belonged to a senior cabinet official whose name history has since forgotten. What history remembers is his response. "Field Marshal, you have been given a direct order from His Majesty's government." Montgomery did not correct the mistaken title. There were more important battles to fight in this particular conversation than a matter of rank. "My soldiers are not chess pieces. They are human beings. And I will not sacrifice human beings to hold a position that serves no military purpose. Find another general if you disagree." The line went silent for nearly a full minute. Through the static, Montgomery could hear the faint sounds of London, office sounds, distant traffic, the ordinary machinery of a city that had not yet learned what a desert looked and smelled and felt like from the inside. Then the cabinet official asked a question that revealed everything about the gap between London and the desert. "What would you propose instead, General?" Montgomery looked at his map, at the red pins, at the vast emptiness of the western desert stretching in every direction, and he thought about something strange that had been happening for the past several weeks, something the official reports couldn't quite explain. Something he had been turning over in his mind the way a man turns a smooth stone over and over in his pocket without being entirely sure why he keeps it. Before we continue, subscribe. We tell stories from World War II that challenge comfortable assumptions about command, courage, and the cost of leadership. German supply convoys had been vanishing, not destroyed in conventional combat, not captured by advancing forces, simply gone. Trucks that left Tobruk never arrived at their destinations. Fuel dumps that existed on Monday were smoking craters by Wednesday. Airfields that housed 30 aircraft somehow contained only burned wreckage and confused survivors by the time the sun came up. The Germans blamed partisans. But there were no partisans in the Libyan desert. The desert itself was the most effective barrier against irregular warfare that nature had ever produced. You needed vehicles to survive in it, and vehicles needed fuel, and fuel was exactly what kept disappearing. They blamed saboteurs. But saboteurs don't destroy 15 aircraft in a single night without being detected by anyone, without leaving tracks that the morning patrols could follow. without making a single prisoner who could be made to talk. Rommel's staff had begun attaching the word inexplicable to their damage reports with a frequency that would have been comic if it weren't so expensive. Montgomery had received a briefing 3 weeks earlier from a major named David Sterling. Tall, soft-spoken, with the angular build of a man who had spent too long in the desert to carry any weight he didn't strictly need. He had the kind of casual confidence that came not from performance, but from the more dangerous quality of actually knowing what he was capable of. Sterling had explained his unit's methods with the detachment of a man describing cricket scores. "We go in at night, sir. Small teams. 4 to 6 men. We hit their aircraft on the ground, their fuel supplies, their communications. We use incendiary devices attached to the landing gear and the fuel tanks. Then we disappear before dawn." Montgomery had asked the obvious question. "Casualties?" Sterling's answer still echoed. "Lower than you'd expect, sir. The desert is very large." And Germans, in Montgomery's considerable experience, did not like the dark any more than anyone else. The difference was that Sterling's men had learned to treat darkness as an ally rather than an obstacle. The unit was called the Special Air Service. It had been founded by Sterling in the summer of 1941 with a handful of men, a shortage of everything except audacity, and an idea so unconventional that most senior officers had dismissed it immediately. The SAS didn't officially occupy any prominent position in the organizational charts that Montgomery's staff kept so meticulously updated. It operated under authorities that bypassed normal military channels, which was precisely why normal military channels kept failing to account for what it was doing. In the months before Montgomery arrived in theater, the SAS had destroyed more German aircraft on the ground than the entire Royal Air Force had managed in direct air combat over the same period. The numbers in the intelligence summaries looked like typographical errors until you checked them twice and realized they weren't. Now, standing in his tent with the War Cabinet's order folded in his pocket, Montgomery considered an alternative to holding a useless ridge with the bodies of British soldiers. "I propose," he said into the telephone, "that we stop thinking about lines on maps and start thinking about logistics." The official did not understand. Montgomery expected this and was not impatient about it. Understanding was not actually what he required from London. What he required from London was silence long enough for him to work. Rommel's problem isn't our position at Rueisat. Rommel's problem is that his tanks require fuel to move. His soldiers require water to live. His aircraft require spare parts to fly. I intend to make all three increasingly difficult to obtain. How? That is a military matter. I will keep the cabinet informed of results. Good day. He disconnected before the official could respond. The signals officer, who had overheard this exchange from the adjacent section of the tent, made a very careful study of the middle distance and said nothing. That night, Montgomery requested a meeting with Sterling. It took place in a tent that smelled of petrol and gun oil, and the particular sourness of men who had been too long without adequate water for washing, far from the main headquarters, where staff officers might overhear things they would then feel obliged to write reports about. Sterling arrived with 2 of his officers and maps of his own, hand-drawn, marked with symbols that appeared in no official military notation, in a shorthand that the SAS had developed because no standard system existed for what they were doing. "These are German supply routes," Sterling said, tracing lines through the empty desert with a finger that was dark from sun and grime in the creases. "These are their fuel dumps. These are their airfields. And these," he tapped a series of small marks near the coast, "are their communication centers. Knock those out, and Rommel's left arm doesn't know what his right arm is doing. He already has that problem to some degree. We can make it significantly worse." Montgomery studied the map for several minutes without speaking. He was a man who believed in silence before decision. His staff had learned that interrupting this silence was inadvisable, regardless of how urgent the matter seemed. Finally, "What do you need? More men, more vehicles, and permission to operate without interference from Cairo." The last request was the most important, and both men understood this without needing to discuss it at length. Sterling's operations had been consistently hampered by staff officers in Cairo who wanted reports, approvals, and coordination with conventional forces. Every report created a paper trail. Every approval took time that the desert didn't allocate. Every coordination requirement revealed information to more people than needed to know it. And more people knowing things meant more opportunities for those things to travel in directions they shouldn't. "You'll have all three," Montgomery said. Sterling nodded once. He was not a man who effused. He folded his maps with the careful economy of someone who understood that maps in the desert were worth more than almost anything else, tucked them under his arm, and left. It was a decision that would reshape the North African campaign, not through grand battles or sweeping maneuvers of the kind that filled newspaper dispatches and parliamentary debates, but through something far more difficult to counter: the systematic and patient destruction of the enemy's ability to fight at all. The Germans called it terrorismus in their internal communications. Their official cables complained about criminal bands operating outside the recognized laws of warfare. Their intelligence assessments struggled to categorize what was happening because the existing categories had been designed for a different kind of war, fought in a different kind of landscape, against a different kind of opponent. The SAS was not cavalry, and not infantry, and not air power, and not any combination of things the German military mind had been trained to expect. It was something else, something the taxonomies hadn't made room for yet. Hitler himself would eventually issue what became known as the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order, on the 18th of October, 1942. All captured commandos were to be shot without trial, regardless of uniform or circumstances. It was a war crime of the clearest possible kind. It was also something else, an admission, written into official German policy at the highest level, that conventional military thinking had run out of answers to what Sterling's men were doing. You issue execution orders for the enemies you cannot catch. You issue them because the alternative is to admit in writing that you don't know how to stop them. But in September 1942, that order was still weeks away. For now, the Germans simply couldn't understand why their logistics kept failing with such regularity, in such varied locations, in ways that left so little trace. Rommel wrote in his diary on the 14th of September, "Our supply situation worsens daily. Causes remain unclear. Investigation ongoing." He had written variations of the same entry half a dozen times in the preceding weeks. The investigation was not producing results. The causes remained stubbornly unclear because the men responsible for them were very good at not being found, and the desert was very large, and the German military machine, for all its formidable qualities, had not been designed for this. The cause was a collection of small groups of men who slept during the day in positions that German aerial reconnaissance consistently failed to detect, and moved at night through terrain that German maps marked as impassable. Who drove modified jeeps and navigated by stars across featureless desert that would have killed any conventional patrol inside 48 hours. Who knew the names of wadis and rock formations that appeared on no official chart. Who carried, in addition to their weapons and water and explosives, an intimate and specific knowledge of exactly where the German supply infrastructure was most vulnerable, and why, and what it would cost to hit it there. One of those men was Sergeant James Ullmans, 27 years old, former factory worker from Nottinghamshire. He had joined the army in 1939 with no particular romantic notion about what it would involve, only the very clear sense that the thing had to be done, and he was capable of doing it. He had found his way to the SAS through a combination of physical endurance that surprised even him, and a navigational ability in featureless terrain that his instructors could not entirely account for. Some men just knew where they were. Ullmans was one of them. On the night of the 17th of September, Ullmans was part of a four-man team approaching a German-held airfield near Bir el Qusayr. They had driven 160 miles across open desert in two jeeps, then concealed the vehicles under camouflage netting in a shallow wadi while the light lasted, eaten cold rations in complete silence, and waited for full dark with the particular discipline of men who had learned that impatience in the desert had a way of becoming fatal. The approach on foot took 3 hours. They moved the final mile and a half in a crouch that dropped to a crawl as they cleared the outer perimeter wire. The ground still held the day's heat beneath their hands and knees, a warmth that felt almost alive, almost personal, in a way that night air never did. The temperature had dropped to the upper 80s in the 4 hours since sunset. Sweat soaked through their shirts and mixed with the fine grit that coated everything in this landscape, skin and metal and canvas alike, that got into your eyes and your food, and eventually, if you stayed long enough, into your thinking. Almonds could see the aircraft from 200 yards out, a mixed complement, including Junkers 87 dive bombers, the Stukas that had been making life expensive for British ground forces since the opening moves of the Desert Campaign. They sat in rows behind low sand berms, guarded by sentries whose patrol routes Almonds had spent the previous 40 minutes memorizing from a distance. German security had improved since the SAS's first raids in 1941. The lesson had been learned, at least partially. More sentries, better lighting around the perimeter, regular patrols with intervals short enough to be inconvenient. Dogs, which were the most dangerous element because dogs operated on information that the human sentries didn't have access to. But the sentries had a weakness that all sentries eventually develop, and that no amount of military discipline can fully cure. They expected threats from the perimeter, from the obvious approaches, the approaches that made tactical sense according to the logic of conventional operations. They watched the darkness outside the wire. They did not watch the aircraft themselves, which were inside the wire, which were therefore inside the defended area, and which were therefore, by the specific and somewhat circular logic of fixed position defense, safe. It took Almonds and his 3 companions 2 hours to work through the gaps in the patrol pattern and reach the aircraft. They moved with a slowness that was not caution so much as precision. Every movement was considered, every pause was timed. The Lewis bombs they carried, small dual-purpose incendiary and explosive devices that Sterling's unit had developed specifically for this kind of work, weighed almost nothing once you had been carrying them for long enough. You stopped feeling them, you just felt the responsibility. Almonds worked along the landing gear and fuel lines of 17 aircraft in complete darkness, identifying components by touch alone, placing charges with the unhurried concentration of a man doing work that he understood completely and that therefore held no mystery except the mystery of whether the fuses were set correctly and whether the timers would hold. He had checked both twice before leaving the jeep. He would not check them again, because checking them again would take time, and time was the one resource that could not be replaced if it ran out. At 1:30 in the morning, the team withdrew through the same gap in the patrol pattern they had used to enter. They moved faster now, not running but moving with a purpose that was the closest thing to running that the terrain allowed without making noise. They had 2 miles to cover before the first charges were due to detonate. They made it to 3 miles. The sky behind them turned a color that had no precise name in any language, something between orange and white, the particular luminosity of burning aviation fuel catching secondary fires. The detonations came in sequence and then in a cascade as tanks cooked off and ammunition added its own percussion to the event. German soldiers appeared along the perimeter wire and fired into the darkness in the general direction of away, which was all the information they had about where the threat had gone. By dawn, 17 aircraft were unrecoverable. 4 men had done this, and 4 men were already 11 miles away in a wadi under camouflage netting, eating cold food in silence and waiting for the light to pass. Rommel received the damage report at his headquarters and read it twice with an expression that his aide later described, with some understatement, as dissatisfied. "Find them," he said. "Find them and bring them in." His staff officers nodded with the professional neutrality of men who had been given instructions they did not know how to execute. How do you find men who appear from the empty desert, do their work in the dark, and return to the empty desert? The desert was 500,000 square miles. The men you were looking for could be anywhere in it, or nowhere in it, because the methods they used to approach their targets left almost nothing behind. A careful search of the area around the destroyed aircraft turned up boot prints that led 200 yards into the sand and then became indistinguishable from the surface disturbance of the night wind. The investigation was ongoing. The causes remained unclear. What Montgomery understood, standing in his command tent in those September weeks, was something that the War Cabinet in London could not grasp from their leather chairs and their polished tables and their maps that showed positions rather than people. Wars are not won by holding positions. Wars are won by destroying the enemy's capacity to fight. And sometimes the most effective way to destroy that capacity involves methods that don't appear in any textbook because the textbooks were written for a different kind of war. He withdrew from Ruysat Ridge on the 18th of September. The War Cabinet was furious. The cable from London was the longest he had received since taking command, and the longest was not the politest. Churchill himself sent a separate message that arrived through different channels and managed to convey considerable dissatisfaction in fewer words. Montgomery's response, delivered by telegram, became famous in certain circles for its brevity. Enemy logistics significantly degraded. Offensive operations to resume within 6 weeks. Trust that results will satisfy. He did not add anything to this. There was nothing to add. Either the results would satisfy or they wouldn't, and no amount of explanatory prose was going to change that. In the weeks that followed, the raids continued. Not always at the same targets, not always by the same methods, not always in the same region of the operational area. Sterling's people had a gift for unpredictability that went beyond mere tactical variation. They seemed to understand intuitively that the most valuable thing they could give the German command was uncertainty, and they were generous with it. A fuel depot here, a communication relay there, an airfield that had been left alone for 2 weeks and was therefore, by the logic of a command that had been surprised too many times, probably safe. It wasn't safe. The Germans rotated their security arrangements. They added more guards. They moved aircraft to different positions within their airfields. They began posting sentries at intervals that should have been sufficient to detect any approach. None of it worked with consistency, because what they were trying to guard against was not a tactic but a capability, and capabilities don't respect the defenses you build against specific previous instances of them. The SAS adapted. When the perimeter defenses improved, they found the supply lines instead. When the supply lines became better patrolled, they found the communication nodes. There was always something. The desert was full of things that were necessary and therefore vulnerable, if you had the patience to find them and the skill to reach them. Montgomery tracked the results in his evening intelligence summaries with the attention of a man watching an experiment he has designed and is not yet certain will work. The numbers moved in the right direction, slowly, not as quickly as he would have liked, but consistently. He had been in the desert long enough to understand that consistency was worth more than speed. 6 weeks after his telegram to London on the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began. The artillery barrage that opened the battle was the heaviest the Western Desert had heard. It was audible 60 miles away in Alexandria, a sound that observers there described as a continuous roll of thunder with no intervals between the strikes. The ground shook. The night sky over El Alamein became a sustained brightness, as if dawn were coming from the wrong direction. British forces advanced across ground that German armor had dominated for the better part of 2 years. But this time, when those German tanks attempted to respond to the advance in the way that Rommel had designed them to respond, with the speed and aggression that had made the Afrika Korps a source of genuine nightmare for British planners, many of them found that they could not move. Not because of mines, not because of mechanical failure, but because the fuel that should have been waiting for them at the forward supply points had not arrived. The trucks that were supposed to bring it had not completed their journeys. The airfields that should have been providing close air support were operating at significantly reduced capacity because of shortfalls in spare parts and ground crew that had originated weeks earlier and had never been fully made good. The Afrika Korps, which had seemed invincible for 2 years, the formation that had driven the British out of Cyrenaica and to the gates of Egypt, that had humiliated better-equipped forces in open battle more times than the official record was comfortable admitting, collapsed in 12 days. The specific mechanism of the collapse was fuel and spare parts, and the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of systematic interference with every logistics chain that had been quietly sustaining Rommel's ability to fight. Montgomery received the intelligence summary confirming the German withdrawal at his tactical headquarters on the 4th of November. He read it twice, set it down on the camp table, and sat with it for a while. Outside, his staff were beginning the particular organized chaos of a headquarters preparing to advance. The sounds were different from the sounds of a headquarters preparing to defend. He had learned, in his considerable career, to hear the difference. "Get me London," he said. The call came through in 40 minutes. Churchill's voice was unmistakable even through the static and the distance and the encryption equipment that sat between his words and Montgomery's ears. "Bernard, congratulations are in order. Thank you, Prime Minister. Rommel is finished. You've done what no one else could manage. In 2 years out here, he was invincible, and now he's running for his life. How did you do it?" Montgomery paused. He was thinking about someone. Not Sterling, whose contribution was documented, whose men would receive their decorations through proper channels, whose name was known at least in the circles where such names circulated. He was thinking about someone else, someone who had given him things that he could not fully account for and could not entirely explain. "Prime Minister, there's someone I need to discuss with you. A civilian operative who provided intelligence that I believe was material to the planning of the offensive. I would like to ensure that his contribution is recognized through whatever channel is appropriate. Bernard." Churchill's tone shifted in a way that was not unfriendly, but was quite definite. "Some contributions are best left unacknowledged, for everyone's sake, including the contributors." The line went dead. Montgomery stood holding the receiver for a long moment. Through the wall of the tent, he could hear his staff continuing their preparations. The ordinary professional sounds of men who had just won a significant battle and understood that winning a significant battle meant more work, not less. He set the receiver down and walked outside. The last time he saw the operative was 3 nights later. Montgomery couldn't sleep, which was unusual. He was not a man plagued by insomnia as a rule. He had long ago developed the professional soldier's ability to sleep when circumstances permitted regardless of what his mind was doing, and circumstances had been permitting with some regularity since the German withdrawal began. But that particular night his mind declined to cooperate, and after an hour he gave up the attempt and walked the perimeter of the camp. He passed the sentries, who saluted with the alertness of men who understood that their commanding general walking the perimeter at 2 in the morning was not an invitation to demonstrate any relaxation of standards. He passed the motor pool where mechanics were already preparing vehicles for the advance toward Tunis, working under hooded lights with the concentration of craftsmen who know their work matters in a way that is not abstract. The moon was nearly full. A figure stood near the fuel depot at the edge of the supply area, speaking quietly with a supply sergeant. Montgomery recognized the operative at a distance of perhaps 30 yards. He was dressed differently from their previous meetings, in clothing that would not have looked out of place on a civilian in any of half a dozen different countries, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder. The sergeant was handing him something. Papers, it appeared. The operative took them and placed them carefully inside his clothing. Montgomery watched and did not approach and did not call out. He was not sure why. The distance between them was short enough to cover in 10 seconds. The night was quiet enough that a word said at a normal conversational volume would have carried without difficulty. But something in the scene made him an observer rather than a participant, and he remained one. The operative turned, as if he had been aware of being watched from the beginning and had simply been waiting for a natural moment to acknowledge it. Their eyes met across the darkness. The man nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, precise and without decoration. Nothing more. Then he walked toward the edge of camp, past the last tent, into the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. His footsteps were quiet on the sand. Quieter, Montgomery would later think, than a man's footsteps on sand ought to be. Montgomery stood watching the place where the darkness had swallowed him. He stood there for several minutes, scanning the horizon. The desert beyond the camp was a study in stillness. A light wind moved the sand in patterns too subtle to follow. Nothing else moved. The supply sergeant walked past, heading back toward the main supply area. "Sergeant." The man stopped, came to attention. "Sir? The man you were speaking with just now? Where did he go?" The sergeant's face held the particular blankness of genuine confusion, which is quite different from the blankness of a man choosing not to answer. "Sir?" The civilian. "At the fuel depot. You handed him documents." "I'm sorry, sir. I've not spoken to anyone tonight. I was doing my inventory check." "The fuel records, sir." He held up a clipboard as if to demonstrate the innocence of this activity. Montgomery studied him for a long moment. The sergeant's eyes held no evasion. His hands were steady on the clipboard. His confusion was entirely convincing because it was entirely real. "Carry on, Sergeant." Sir. The man walked away. Montgomery looked back at the desert. The place where the figure had been was empty sand and pale moonlight and the sound of a light wind that carried no information beyond itself. He stood there for a while longer. Then he walked back to his quarters and lay down on his cot, and did not sleep for the remainder of the night. A week later, Montgomery mentioned the operative to Brigadier Edgar Williams during a briefing on the Tunisian advance. Williams was his intelligence chief, a former Oxford history don who had turned out to have a remarkable aptitude for military intelligence, possibly because both disciplines required the same fundamental skill of distinguishing between what the evidence actually showed and what you wanted it to show. The intelligence asset, Montgomery said, the civilian. I want to send a commendation through proper channels. I need to know what the proper channel is for someone operating outside the normal structure. Williams frowned with the focused quality of a man searching his memory for something specific. Which asset, sir? The one who provided the supply route intelligence, the fuel depot locations, the communication relay positions that we hit in August and September. He briefed me personally on 3 separate occasions. You were present at 2 of them. Williams's frown did not change in character, but deepened in degree. Sir, our intelligence on German supply infrastructure came from ultra-intercepts and aerial reconnaissance, standard channels. There was no civilian asset involved in that work, not to my knowledge, and I believe my knowledge of our intelligence sources is reasonably complete. He paused, then added with the careful phrasing of a man who respects his superior and is choosing his words accordingly. Are you quite well, sir? The pace of the last months has been considerable, even for someone of your constitution. I'm fine, Montgomery said, with a finality that closed the subject. That night he went through his personal files, every map the operative had provided, every report, every piece of paper that had passed between them. He was systematic about it, going through each folder in turn, reading each label before opening it. He found the folder. It was labeled in his own handwriting, Civilian Asset, Supply Intelligence, October 1942. He recognized the handwriting with the certainty you have for your own hand. He had written those words. He remembered writing them. The folder contained blank paper, 6 sheets of it, utterly unmarked. He searched his desk with increasing thoroughness, his quarters, his briefcase, the box where he kept documents requiring personal attention rather than staff handling. Nothing. He sat alone in his tent, holding the empty folder, and tried to reconstruct from memory the specific content of the information he had received. He could remember the substance of it, the general shape, the conclusions he had drawn and acted on, but the specific details, the grid references, the timing windows, the exact locations of the fuel dumps whose destruction he could trace through the subsequent campaign like a line of footprints through sand, these would not resolve into clarity. They remained at the edge of memory, clear in outline and empty in content. The way a word you know well sometimes empties of meaning if you stare at it too long. He opened the folder one more time. Fine grains of sand had gathered in the crease of the spine, the precise pale sand of the western desert. He closed the folder and set it on his desk and did not look at it again that night. The war continued. Montgomery continued. There was a great deal of war left, and he was very good at it, which meant it demanded his complete attention and received it. The desert campaign concluded in May 1943 when the last Axis forces in North Africa surrendered in Tunisia, then Sicily, then Italy, then France, then the long grinding advance across northern Europe that ended on Lüneburg Heath in May 1945, where Montgomery took the German surrender in the north with the same contained precision he had brought to every significant moment of his command. He was made a field marshal. He was given a viscountcy. He was the man who broke the Desert Fox, the name that history would settle on, the shorthand that captured a particular chapter of the war's story and filed it under the heading of British determination defeating German genius. The official history of El Alamein credited ultra-intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, Montgomery's tactical brilliance, the courage of the Eighth Army, the failures of German logistics that had been building through the summer and were accelerated by the SAS operations against supply lines. All of it true. All of it, in Montgomery's private assessment, incomplete. At a dinner party in London in 1947, A retired colonel who had served in Italy asked him about El Alamein. The conversation was pleasant, well lubricated by a Burgundy that was doing what good Burgundy does to the ordinary stiffness of an English dinner. The colonel had been in Italy during the desert campaign, had missed it entirely, and wanted to hear the real story from the man who had been there. There was someone, Montgomery began, a man who... He stopped. What could he say? That a civilian appeared in his command tent with information that his intelligence staff had not produced and could not account for. That this man vanished without trace into empty desert. That every piece of paper he had ever provided was now gone, replaced by blank sheets, or in one case by sand. That his intelligence chief, a meticulous man with a thorough knowledge of their sources, had no memory of the man's existence. A man who what? The colonel prompted. Montgomery took a drink of wine. A man who served his country well, he said. Many did. The colonel nodded, satisfied with this non-answer in the way that people often are when they have asked a question they did not entirely intend to push, and moved on to discussing the difficulties of the Italian campaign and the question of whether Anzio could have been handled differently, which was a subject on which several people at the table had strong opinions, and which carried the conversation safely away from the desert. Montgomery never mentioned the operative again, not to his wife, not in any of the letters he wrote to former colleagues in the years after the war, not in his memoirs, which ran to hundreds of pages on the desert campaign and contained 3 separate chapters on the planning of El Alamein, each one detailed and precise and entirely silent on the subject of the civilian who had given him things he could not account for. It was not a deliberate omission, exactly, or if it was the kind that happens not from choice, but from the gradual understanding that certain things cannot be communicated to people who were not there. Certain things require a context that cannot be reconstructed after the fact. Certain things live only in the silence between what happened and what can be said about it. Some nights, in the years that followed, he would wake from dreams of the desert. He had many such dreams. The desert had been a formative experience in the way that only extended periods of extreme intensity can be formative. The kind that do not recede with time, but instead become more vivid as everything surrounding them fades. In the dreams, he was always standing at the same spot, at the edge of the supply depot, moonlight on the sand, and always the same figure walked away into the darkness beyond the perimeter lights. And always, in the dreams, Montgomery called out a question he had never asked in the waking encounter. Who sent you? The figure never answered. It never turned. It simply dissolved into the night in the way that figures in dreams dissolve, not dramatically but gently, the way a sound fades when you stop listening for it. He woke from these dreams quietly, without the physical distress that nightmares produce, and lay in the dark until sleep returned or didn't, and thought about logistics. His son David found the folder in 1976, while sorting his father's papers after his death in March of that year. The viscountcy had passed. The funeral had been attended by dignitaries from a dozen countries. The newspapers had run the photographs. The beret, the sharp eyes, the expression of a man who is permanently assessing the military value of his surroundings. A national hero, the last of a particular kind. Among the personal papers was a folder labeled in his father's handwriting. Civilian Asset, Supply Intelligence, October 1942. David opened it expecting documents. He was a practical man, with a practical man's assumptions about what folders contained. Sand shifted across his hands and onto the floor. He looked into the folder. Empty, except for a single photograph. The photograph showed a landscape he recognized from his father's accounts as the Western Desert. Rock formations, open ground, a pale sky that gave no information about the time of day. And at the edge of the frame, partly obscured by the angle of the shot, what might have been a human figure, or might have been a shadow thrown by one of the rock formations, or might have been the particular way that light behaves in that landscape when the sun is at a certain angle. David showed it to a military historian who was compiling materials for a biography. What do you make of this? The historian studied the folder, the label, the photograph, with the careful attention of someone who does this professionally and has learned to be cautious about what conclusions they allow themselves to draw from ambiguous evidence. Probably nothing, he said. Desert fatigue was extremely common. Men saw things in conditions of heat and stress and sleep deprivation that they would not see under ordinary circumstances. Even senior commanders were not immune. It would be genuinely surprising if someone of Montgomery's experience under the pressures of that campaign had not experienced something of the kind at some point. He handed the folder back. "I wouldn't include it. It would confuse readers who are looking for a coherent account of the campaign, and there's nothing here that could be verified anyway." David nodded and filed the folder away, with other miscellaneous items in a box marked personal, non-military, which was perhaps an imprecise categorization, but was the closest available. In 2003, a researcher at the Imperial War Museum was working through Montgomery's personal papers as part of a digitization project. The collection was substantial, decades of a significant life, documented with the thoroughness of a man who understood that he was making history and that history required records. She found the folder tucked between supply requisitions from October 1942 and a letter from Churchill dated the following month, the one in which Churchill congratulated Montgomery on the victory in the specific terms that had been quoted in every biography and documentary since. She opened the folder expecting documents. Sand shifted across her desk and onto the floor. She brushed it aside with the slight irritation of someone dealing with an archival oddity, which was not uncommon in physical collections. Things got into things. Paper deteriorated in ways that produced unexpected detritus. The desert sand of 60 years ago was not the strangest thing she had found inside a folder. She examined the photograph. It was more faded than a photograph of its age should have been, but still legible. She held it up to the light. Rock formations, open ground. At the edge of the frame, a shape that her eye kept insisting was a human figure, specifically a figure in the act of turning away, one hand partially raised. She ran it through the image enhancement software that was then available, which was considerably more capable than what had existed even a decade earlier. The figure became clearer. A man, certainly, standing at the left edge of the frame, his body in three-quarter profile, facing away from the camera. The raised hand was distinct enough to read as a gesture of farewell, though she was aware that this might be the projection of pattern matching onto ambiguous data. She saved the enhanced image to the project archive, wrote a note for the catalog record. Unidentified individual, Western Desert vicinity, October 1942. Possible intelligence operative. No further documentation exists. The note was accurate and said exactly as much as the evidence supported, which was not very much. The next morning, when she returned to continue her work, the enhanced image file could not be opened. The operating system reported it as corrupted. She tried recovery software. She tried accessing the raw data. She tried the backup that the system created automatically each evening. All produced the same result. The original photograph had faded overnight to plain paper. Not the yellowing or foxing of age, but a uniform paleness, as if whatever had made the image had simply stopped being present. Only the sand remained, gathered in a small pile at the corner of her desk. She swept it into the bin, documented the loss in the project log with the neutral language of professional archival practice, and moved on to the next folder. "There are people in this work," she wrote in a private notebook she kept during the project, "who say that archives are just collections of paper. I used to agree with them. I'm less certain now. Sometimes I think that certain objects choose what they hold and what they release and when, and that the reasons for these choices are not always accessible to the people doing the looking." She crossed this out. It was not the kind of observation that belonged in professional records. What Montgomery understood, what he could never quite bring himself to explain to anyone who had not been in the desert, was something about the architecture of certain victories, not the victories that unfold as planned, as the result of superior resources applied with superior skill, which are the victories that fill the histories because they are comprehensible and can be reduced to lessons that can be applied elsewhere. But the other kind, the victories that hinge on a decision made at the right moment, on information received from a source that cannot be fully accounted for, on an instinct that turns out to be correct in ways that the available evidence at the time did not fully justify. Some victories have architects who refuse to be remembered, who appear when they are needed and are gone when the work is done, who leave behind no documentation because documentation would invite questions. And questions would invite investigation, and investigation would find nothing, and the nothing would be taken for proof of fabrication rather than proof of the kind of absence that means something rather than nothing. The official history of El Alamein credits ultra-intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, Montgomery's tactical brilliance, and his insistence on preparation over improvisation. The courage of the Eighth Army, which contained men from more countries than most people remember. The failures of German logistics that had been building for months before the battle began. All of it true, none of it complete. If you had been Montgomery, if a stranger appeared with information that your intelligence staff could not account for and could not independently verify, information that cost him nothing to give, and that he offered without explanation and without apparent interest in anything you could offer in return, would you have trusted it? Would you have built your battle plan, at least partly, on knowledge from a man who might not, in any conventional sense, have existed? Would you have kept silent for the rest of your life about someone who might have made your greatest victory possible, not because you were instructed to keep silent, but because you genuinely did not know what to say? Write your answer in the comments. Montgomery's last recorded words, according to the nurse on duty when he died on the 24th of March, 1976 at his home in Hampshire, were incoherent. She attributed this to the end-stage confusion that is common in the final hours. The mind releasing its hold on language as it releases its hold on other things. His son David was present. He heard something different from what the nurse heard, which is perhaps not surprising, since he had been listening to his father's voice for 60 years and knew its registers in a way that a stranger could not. His father's eyes were open, fixed on the window and on the darkness beyond the glass. "There he is," Montgomery said, his hand lifted from the blanket. A small gesture, almost a wave. Then Bernard Law Montgomery, 1st Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, Victor of El Alamein, Field Marshal of the British Empire, the man who broke the Desert Fox, closed his eyes for the last time. Outside, the Hampshire night was cold and still and entirely ordinary. The frost on the lawn bore no footprints. The folder still exists, somewhere in the archive. The sand inside it came from the Western Desert, according to a geological analysis conducted in 2005 by a researcher who did not explain in any published document why she had thought it worth doing, and who declined to comment on the results when contacted by a journalist writing a piece on the Montgomery papers for a centenary publication. The label is in Montgomery's handwriting. Everyone who has examined it agrees on this. The contents have not been recovered. If you want more stories about the shadows behind history's turning points, the operations that were never entered in any record, the people who were present and then were not, subscribe now.